I remember those early days at Cambridge, feeling like an outsider among the brilliant minds that surrounded me. My hunger for knowledge consumed me, but so did my awkwardness, my inability to connect with people the way I connected with quantum mechanics and theoretical physics. The world of particles and probabilities made sense to me in ways that human interaction never could. I threw myself into my studies, seeking recognition and understanding in equal measure, driven by an insatiable need to prove myself worthy of standing among the giants of science. The transition to my work in America brought new opportunities and new relationships. I met Kitty at a gathering in California, a biologist with a sharp mind and a complicated past. She became my wife, my partner, through the extraordinary journey that lay ahead. But there was also June, a psychiatrist with ties to causes I found compelling, though they would later haunt me. Jung was involved with groups that challenged the established order, organizations that advocated for change in ways that made powerful people uncomfortable. Our connection was intense and complicated, and though I married Kitty, Jean remained a presence in my thoughts long after our relationship ended. When the war began spreading across Europe, the scientific community buzzed with terrifying rumors. The Germans, we heard, were racing to develop a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen, something that could harness the power of the atom itself. The fear was palpable among those of us who understood the implications. If the Nazis succeeded in weaponizing nuclear fission before the Allies, the consequences would be catastrophic beyond imagination. I discussed these concerns with colleagues, with Einstein, wondering if such a weapon could even be contained, if the very atmosphere might ignite in a chain reaction that would consume the world. Then came the approach from General Leslie Groves, a military man with an enormous task before him. The government wanted to assemble the greatest scientific minds in America for a single purpose: to turn theoretical physics into a practical weapon before our enemies could do the same. They called it the Manhattan Project, and they wanted me to lead the scientific effort. The responsibility was staggering, but I accepted. How could I not? The fate of civilization might depend on winning this terrible race. We established our laboratory at Los Alamos, in the New Mexico desert, a remote location chosen for its isolation and secrecy. I recruited the best physicists, mathematicians, and engineers I could find. These were people I had studied with, competed against, admired from afar. Now they would work under my direction, building something unprecedented. The pressure was immense from the moment we began. Every day that passed was a day the Germans might be getting closer to their own breakthrough. We worked relentlessly, calculating, theorizing, experimenting, pushing the boundaries of what science had achieved. The technical challenges seemed insurmountable at times. We were trying to compress years of theoretical research into months of practical application. There were questions about critical mass, about triggering mechanisms, about materials and engineering that had never been tested. We debated implosion designs versus gun-type assemblies, argued over enrichment processes, and worried constantly about whether our calculations were correct. One miscalculation, one overlooked variable, and the entire project could fail, or worse, succeed in ways we hadn't anticipated. Living at Los Alamos created its own unique pressures. Scientists and their families isolated in the desert, unable to discuss their work with anyone outside the project, constantly under military scrutiny. Security was paramount. Every conversation could be monitored, every movement tracked. The military didn't entirely trust us, especially those of us with past associations that looked questionable on paper. My relationship with Zhang came under particular scrutiny. I had visited her in San Francisco in 1943, and federal agents had followed me, documented our meeting. These details went into files that I knew existed somewhere, growing thicker with observations and suspicions. Then came the devastating news that Zhang had taken her own life. The grief hit me with unexpected force, compounded by guilt and the inability to properly mourn while carrying the weight of the project. There was no time to step away, no space to process the loss. The work demanded everything, and factions within Los Alamos were already forming, different groups pushing different approaches, and I had to hold it all together while dealing with my own internal collapse. Niels Bohr arrived, and his presence brought both reassurance and additional pressure. He brought encouraging intelligence that the German program might not be as advanced as we had feared, but this knowledge came with its own burden. If we succeeded, if we actually built this weapon, what would that mean? Bohr and I discussed the implications late into the night. This wasn't just about ending the current conflict. Whatever we created would fundamentally alter the nature of warfare, of international relations, of human civilization itself. Edward Teller kept pushing his ideas about a fusion-based weapon, something even more powerful than what we were building. I approved his continued research, though my focus remained on completing the fission device. We had to prove the concept first, show that controlled nuclear energy release was possible on a scale sufficient for a weapon. Everything else could wait. As we approached the test date, the tension became almost unbearable. We had poured everything into this moment, billions of dollars, the efforts of thousands of people, years of accumulated scientific knowledge. The device was assembled at the Trinity site, and we made our final preparations. Weather delays added to the anxiety. We needed specific conditions, and nature wasn't cooperating. Finally, in the early morning hours of July 16th, 1945, the moment arrived. I watched from the control bunker as the countdown proceeded. All the calculations, all the theories, all the arguments and innovations and desperate problem-solving came down to this single test. Would it work? Would it work too well? Had we considered every possibility? The detonation, when it came, exceeded even our most optimistic predictions. The light, the heat, the shockwave that followed, the mushroom cloud rising into the desert sky. We had succeeded. We had created something terrible and magnificent, and in that moment, ancient words from the Bhagavad Gita came to my mind, words I had read years before, now suddenly horrifyingly relevant. The politicians took over after Trinity. Decisions about deployment, about targets, about strategy moved beyond our control. President Truman made the choice to use the weapon against Japan without consulting those of us who had built it. I had hoped there might be a demonstration first, or that Stalin might be informed before deployment to avoid future complications. Instead, Hiroshima was struck, then Nagasaki, days later. The destruction was total, the casualties beyond comprehension. We had ended the war, but at a cost that would echo through history. The public praised me as a hero, the man who had helped end the conflict and save countless lives that would have been lost in a prolonged invasion of Japan. But I felt no heroism, only a growing weight of responsibility for the destruction we had unleashed. The images from Japan haunted me, the reports of the aftermath, the understanding of what we had actually done to real people, to cities full of families and children and ordinary lives. My meeting with President Truman crystallized my growing disillusionment. I tried to express my feelings about the weapon's use, my sense of personal responsibility for the consequences. Truman responded with contempt, making clear that he considered himself responsible for the decision, not me. He saw my moral qualms as weakness, as a scientist trying to claim credit while avoiding accountability. The disconnect between us was total. He was a politician who had made a strategic choice. I was a physicist confronting the human implications of my creation. I began advocating for international control of nuclear technology, for cooperation rather than competition in this new atomic age. Lewis Strauss recruited me as a scientific advisor to the Atomic Energy Commission, and I used that position to argue for restraint. But the Cold War was already beginning, tensions with the Soviet Union escalating rapidly. Teller's hydrogen bomb concept gained renewed support, a weapon that would dwarf even what we had built at Los Alamos. I argued against pursuing it, not just on technical grounds, though there were significant challenges, but on moral ones. Where would it end? How many times over did we need the capability to obliterate our enemies? The Soviet Union detonated their own atomic device far sooner than American officials had predicted, and immediately suspicions turned toward espionage, toward the possibility that someone had shared our secrets. Strauss and others began looking for traitors, for explanations that fit their worldview. My past associations, my brother's communist ties, Jean's political activities, all of it came under renewed scrutiny. Strauss, in particular, seemed to harbor resentment toward me, though I couldn't entirely understand why. There had been a moment when I had dismissed his concerns about exporting radioisotopes, not taking his position seriously enough, perhaps. There had been my recommendation to negotiate with the Soviets rather than simply outpace them in an arms race. These positions put me at odds with the hardliners who were gaining influence. In 1954, I found myself facing a security clearance hearing, an administrative proceeding that was supposed to determine whether I should maintain my access to classified information. The setup was irregular from the start. My attorney couldn't access my own security file, while the opposing counsel had full access. Witnesses who had supported me were called, and their testimony twisted to suggest doubt and suspicion. My past was dissected, every decision questioned, every association examined for evidence of disloyalty. William Borden had written to the authorities making accusations, claiming I was a security risk based on my file, but it became clear that Strauss had orchestrated much of what followed. He had provided access to my files, encouraged the investigation, shaped the narrative. The hearing felt predetermined, a show trial designed to destroy my reputation and remove my influence from policy discussions. They brought up my relationship with Jean, my brother's politics, my own past flirtations with leftist causes. They made everything look sinister, everything suspect. Edward Teller's testimony hurt the most. He testified that he lacked confidence in me, recommending the revocation of my clearance. Here was someone I had worked with, someone whose research I had supported, and he couldn't bring himself to stand by me when it mattered. Others defended me, including Groves, but the outcome was already decided. The board revoked my Q clearance, effectively ending my role in nuclear policy and damaging my public standing irreparably. The personal cost was devastating, but I tried to find solace in teaching and research in the academic world that had always been my true home. I watched from the outside as the arms race I had feared became reality, as arsenals grew beyond any rational military purpose, as the world lived under the shadow of potential annihilation. Everything I had warned about was coming to pass, and I had been silenced, pushed aside by people who saw only strategic advantage and national security, never pausing to consider the ultimate consequences. Lewis Strauss's ambitions eventually caught up with him. In 1959, when he sought Senate confirmation for a cabinet position, his role in my persecution came to light. Testimony revealed his personal motives, his manipulation of the process, his vendetta disguised as patriotic duty. The Senate rejected his nomination, a small vindication, but one that came too late to restore what had been taken from me. Years passed, and the political climate slowly shifted. In 1963, President Johnson presented me with the Enrico Fermi Award, a gesture meant to rehabilitate my reputation, to acknowledge my contributions while the nation had moved past the paranoia of the McCarthy era. I accepted it with mixed feelings, knowing it couldn't undo the damage, couldn't restore the lost years or repair the broken trust. I thought back to a conversation with Einstein years earlier, back in 1947, when the full implications of what we had done were beginning to sink in. We had discussed the future, the chain reaction we had started that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with politics and human nature. Einstein understood, as I was coming to understand, that we hadn't just created a weapon. We had fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization, creating the means for our own extinction and leaving future generations to grapple with that terrible legacy. The question that haunted me wasn't whether we should have built the first atomic device. Given the threat we faced, given what we knew at the time, I still believed we had no choice. But what came after? The rush to build more, to build bigger, to threaten complete annihilation rather than seek genuine security through cooperation and control, that was where we failed. That was where I failed, unable to convince those with power that there had to be another way, unable to articulate clearly enough the danger we were creating for ourselves. I watched the world embrace nuclear energy, even as it built nuclear arsenals, saw the proliferation I had warned against become inevitable, saw new nations join the nuclear club and old tensions persist. The technology we had pioneered at Los Alamos spread despite all efforts to contain it, exactly as I had predicted it would. You couldn't put the knowledge back, couldn't unmake the discovery. Once humanity knew that atomic power was achievable, the only question was who would master it and how they would use it. My legacy remains complicated and contradictory. I helped end a terrible conflict, but unleashed something potentially more terrible. I tried to promote responsibility and restraint, but was swept aside by forces more concerned with dominance than wisdom. I lived long enough to see some recognition return, but never long enough to see the world truly grapple with the challenges we created. The weapons still exist, the arsenals still threaten, the possibility of catastrophe remains ever present. Whether future generations will find a way to step back from that precipice, or whether we truly did start a chain reaction that will ultimately destroy us, that question remains unanswered, hanging over humanity like the mushroom cloud that rose over Trinity all those years ago.